I spent a lot of years in television, 16 years in newsrooms, and a lot of people wanted to know why I got out. There were personal reasons for it, and to this day it's still flattering when I run into new people and they say, hey, I remember you from the news. Along the way I discovered something about myself. I thought I was really good at telling stories, and I enjoyed my time as a storyteller. But I figured out one day that my gift was something else. Gary Kelly, who's still the news director at ABC 3340, called me into his office one day and he said, what did you do? You know, and I kind of jumped back the same way you did just now, because that's not usually the start of a good conversation if you're an employee. I said, what's the problem? He said, I just got calls from both sides of the story you did today thanking us for sticking it to the other side. That's not supposed to happen. One of the cardinal rules of journalism is that you know you did your job if both sides are ticked off equally. But here we had both sides of this very contentious story who were happy with the way they were portrayed. And that's when I figured out, it's like, storytelling's fun, but maybe my gift is helping other people tell their story in a way that's better than what they would have done otherwise. And that was, to Gary's detriment, the seeds of my escape from television. And I decided, you know, I can take these same skills that I've been honing for years and do other things with it. So I went to work for the American Red Cross, and while I was with the Red Cross, I faced some pretty serious communication challenges. I was here at the Birmingham area chapter during Katrina, and you would think several hundred miles away that we didn't see that much impact, but Birmingham was actually one of the closest areas to the impacted zone of Katrina, New Orleans and South Mississippi, that had its resources, had its infrastructure intact, and really had its act together. And once word started getting out throughout the impact zone that you could go to Birmingham and get client services, we saw people digging and scratching and clawing their last ounce of gasoline, driving up here for assistance. With no outside help from Red Cross anywhere in the country, the Birmingham area chapter did 5,756 family service cases, helped over 18,000 people, and helped distribute over $8 million worth of assistance. It's just staggering, the numbers of people who came here. I say this because in my position as the public affairs administrator, it was my job to get this information out to the public. And for a 48-hour period, I was completely unable to send a fax from our fax machine because people had gotten the fax number and were dialing it in a desperate attempt to reach a human being. This was getting in my way of communicating what I needed to let the public know how they could help, let these potential clients know how we could help them, and how to get them in touch with the services they needed in their time of need. So after we got finished with Katrina, and after I did a stint with the United Way as a loan executive, I got ahead on my annual report for the next year and lied to my boss. I told her I was still working on the annual report. What I was really doing was locking myself in the office for 2 solid weeks, playing around with blogs, playing around with podcasting, playing around with RSS feeds and RSS readers, and at the end of 2 weeks I came out with a custom skinned branded RSS reader that would plug in the local news media into what was going on at the Red Cross. If I had gone to my boss and said, hey, I've got this idea for how we can put some stuff together, the answer would have been, oh, that sounds really nice, but we don't have time for that. So while it worked for me, I don't necessarily advocate that you lie to your boss about how you spend your time. But the important thing is I was able to tie a number of technologies together with no formal training, with no background in blogs or any of these other things, and I created a tool that worked. And that became the genesis of the Red Cross's foray into social media for disaster communications, and that's how I kind of fell into all this stuff. A few years later, I moved up to national headquarters, and not long after that, after a couple of years, that position was eliminated along with about 1,000 others at the national headquarters level. And I was very fortunate to land at Alabama Power, which is great. We got another century-old organization with very conservative corporate culture, and it's time again to try and see if there are ways that we can use existing tools to communicate better. And that's part of what I do with Alabama Power Company, and part of how I see the use of social media. So we're going to talk about social media as the 21st century canary. And for you to understand the implications of this for crisis, I need to introduce to you the concept of framing. When you get into a crisis mode, how you perceive information initially can have an effect on what you think a week later, a month later, a year later, or 10 years later. If I were to ask you, what's the biggest river in the United States, what would you say? Mississippi. Some of you are spelling it out right now with I's and S's and P's all the way across the board. So here is the mighty Mississippi River. And in orange coming in, we have the Missouri River. Now, I want to take you through something here and show you. If you go through and measure from A to B, top to bottom on the Mississippi, and then measure from C to D with the Missouri River, you will find that up until maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the Missouri from C to D was about 20 miles longer. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers went in and did some work, and actually from C to D is now slightly shorter than A to B on our map. But you know, it's stunning. The Mississippi is obviously the biggest river because that's the way we've always heard it, right? Well, who said that the Missouri River should be measured from C to D? Because if you follow it from the top all the way down to the bottom of the river, why not measure it from C to B? This is a satellite shot showing what happens with the river, and you can see the color change because the silt is different coming from the Missouri end into the Mississippi. And if you track the flow, you'll see that about 45 to 70% of the water that flows in the lower Mississippi comes from the Missouri, depending on the season, depending on drought, depending on time of year. Ike, why are you wasting our time telling us about the river? Because the river and the way you've learned about it has everything to do with this concept of framing. Why is it not C to B? Well, when those first settlers got in their stagecoaches, got in their wagons, and went to the boundary, the Mississippi was the single boundary. That was the line that everybody knew. And this part of the river right here, about 50 miles north of St. Louis, well, they didn't know how far back that went. They didn't know how big it was. And then the steamboat goes up and down, and we get all those romantic stories and Mark Twain and everything else, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, everything happening on the mighty Mississippi River. But framing gives us context. Because everybody assumed that the Mississippi was the biggest, baddest, grandest thing in the country, the Missouri is obviously just the tributary. But if you want the truth, the Missouri is the biggest river in the United States. And you will never, ever learn it any other way than the Mississippi because of framing. Framing is what gives context to facts. You can lay the facts out there, but if you provide the right story, the right anecdote, the right perspective, you can change the way people see those facts within that frame. Framing gives facts context. This is especially important in the modern environment that we're in now, because as you have people empowered through social media to share what they've always shared with word of mouth, but doing it through time and space using these tools, you will find that people are quickly coming to their first impressions based on what their friends say. And then they do what? They pass it along. Does anybody know what this is? This is the killer whale, and this is the trainer that was killed by the killer whale at SeaWorld a little over a year ago. A really good friend of mine, Cami Heiza, does PR, and she's handled the SeaWorld account for a long time. She told me that at the time that this happened, that they were seeing roughly 5,000 tweets an hour on Twitter about this. You want to talk about trying to manage a flood of information. Forget the Mississippi. Follow the river of Twitter. Now I want you to consider that 5,000 tweets an hour for SeaWorld, and since that time, Twitter has tripled in size and in its user base. It will tell you now that maybe 8 to 10% of adults who use the internet are on Twitter and active on Twitter. 94% are aware of it. And if you don't think that the information going in is having an influence, then you're not paying attention to framing. That's why I call social media the canary, the 21st century canary.